everybody, and welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friends, Charles.
Oh, yes, we say friends, the plural, again today because we are joined by the fantastic author, Stephen Aryan. Stephen, thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. Looking forward to this.
Oh, the pleasure is all ours. People might, recognize Stephen's name. He's the author of the critically acclaimed Quest for Heroes duology, as well as the Age of Darkness and Age of Dread trilogies. His debut Battlemage was a finalist for the David Gemmell Morningstar Award and won the inaugural Hellfest Inferno Award. Now that is quite an award to win, the Hellfest Inferno Award. You can't argue with that. And he's previously written for Tor.com category as well. I think some of our guests would nominate us for that.
Yeah.
But welcome, Stephen. Thank you so much. And of course, obviously, we're here today to talk about your upcoming release, the Judas Blossom, book one of the Nightingale and the Falcon, which comes out on July 11th. So only a few days away, or like a week or two away at the time of this recording. And we want to thank Angry Robot for sending us a couple copies. We had the privilege of being able to read it in anticipation of talking to you today, Stephen. So congratulations on the upcoming release.
Thank you. Yeah. Start of a new trilogy, a new world, all brand new. So it's starting over a whole reset button again. This is it. Right. New fans, old fans get something completely different, and we start over.
But a lot of folks might find this new world somewhat familiar because you're taking a crack at historical fantasy here with a focus primarily on the Mongolian Empire, and we were super excited. We don't get to dive into as much historical fiction or historical fantasy here as maybe we'd like to, but it was really cool seeing how you blended some real historical figures and settings and events with the fantastical that we're really excited to read. So props to you for finding that awesome blend there.
Thank you. It was a challenge, to say the least. Yeah.
So what inspired you to take this such divergent path here and dive into historical fantasy? What was the inspiration for just, I'm going to write a book using like the Mongolian Empire as a reference?
Well, apparently I like to torture myself because it was really difficult to do. I never want to do the same thing twice when I start a new series. I want to do something different. And I'd done 2 trilogies where magic was very heavy. I did the duology, the Quest for Heroes, which was based upon the quest trope, but with other things going on. And there was not a lot of magic in that. And for the last 4 years ago, I'd been watching a bunch of things. I'd been reading some nonfiction books about this era. I don't know if you saw the Netflix TV series Marco Polo.
I did, and I had a question queued up about that.
Up to me.
There you go. So that takes place in the same era, but a different part of the world. And now that you've read the Judas Blossom, there's overlap with certain characters that appear in the book. Absolutely. It's not a spoiler; it's part of history. So Kublai Khan obviously features over in Mongolia and China.
Such a great character in that show too.
Oh yeah. Benedict Wong, British actor. Fantastic in that role. And of course, now he's Wong in all the Marvel movies and totally unrecognizable again. But yes, so I'd watched a bunch of that, all these kind of things. And I thought we always see the stories from the viewpoint of the invaders. In this case, the Mongols taking on, occupying, trying to attack the Chinese and so on with Kublai. And I wanted to flip it around and have the story from the perspective of the people being invaded, fighting back against a rebellion. Also, I was leaning into my kind of heritage and history because some of my family comes from the Middle East and from Iran. It's where my surname comes from on my dad. So all of these things swirled around in my brain 4 or 5 years ago. And then I started researching different time periods and looking into it and different events. And all of the main events in the Judas Blossom are historically accurate up to a point. So they all happened who was there, how they happened, and what exactly happened has changed a little bit, and the timings have changed to make the story flow more cohesively. Because sometimes the wars would go on for 2, 3, 4 years, and I can't just be like, yep, now we're going to skip 2 years and the war's over. And now the story carries on. It's like, people are like, well, what happened in those 2 years? Okay, that's 7 books by itself. I haven't got time. So I have had to manipulate certain things. So that's why, that's the fantasy part, if you like. But there is some mild supernatural other stuff in the book, but generally it's fairly close to our world in terms of history. So if people are expecting, dragons or overt magic or anything like that, that isn't the case. This is more politics, war, sieges, spycraft and spies, and all kind of backstabbing and stuff like that, and court politics that you've seen in other shows and books, with a little bit of sauce on the edge that's something else that creeps in around the edges. So
for sure. And that's part of what I loved about this. I would feel really confident recommending this to fans of historical fiction who don't delve too deeply into the fantasy genre typically, because there are those supernatural elements, but they're subtle compared to a lot of what we've read on this podcast. And then you also have the fantasy elements, because I know when I first saw this, I was like, oh, is this historical fiction? We don't read a lot of that on this podcast, but all right, let's see. And then I saw it was called historical fantasy. I was like, all right, there's gonna be something here, and there is something to enjoy for our fantasy fans too. It's a nice middle ground there. It's, I'm sure, hard to find the happy medium, but I think you did it.
Thank you. It was difficult to marry the two things together because I wanted it to feel fairly historically accurate. I've taken some things out on purpose. I've ignored certain names, details, situations. I've streamlined some of the things because it's such a complicated part of history and a part of the world. And there's so many other things going on that I had to kind of ignore some of the research that I've done, because I'm already throwing readers into a brand new world. And even though it's part of Earth, it'll be a part of the world they're probably not familiar with. Cultures, customs, names, countries that no longer exist, that, might sound familiar to what we have today. So there's a lot of new information that I'm throwing at a person. So I've taken out some things on purpose and made certain things slightly more comfortable for an English speaking audience. When it's translated into other languages, they might start putting some of that stuff back in and, using the correct terms. But I thought for English readers, let's just kind of ease their way into it, and then we'll trickle things in throughout the story. So.
Right. To quote your own words here in the process, you said, so while the Judas Blossom follows historic events, I've taken a number of liberties. The goal is to create a dramatic story set in a part of the world many people know little or nothing about, while hopefully remaining true to the spirit of history. Yeah. I'm wondering, when reading that, how much pressure did you feel to be like historically accurate? Was that a challenging thing for you to figure out what is like history you wanted to make sure was included and what you could skip over? What was that process like?
It was, as I said, I like to torture myself, apparently. It was really, really difficult. It was really tricky. There are certain events that I couldn't ignore because they were so big and they changed that part of the world so much. Having read the book, what one of them is. It's to do with a siege, and it changes a great many things. It's like dominoes that trickle and hit other things and carry on. And it's like, I had to include that. And when during the editing process, I'd be talking to my editor and she'd say, can we move this event? And I sort of thought about it and said, if you do that, it'll have this knock-on effect here, 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 and here. Like, okay, can we change the angles slightly? It was very, very difficult. As the trilogy goes on, I've taken more liberties and I veer a little bit more away from being as close to history as I can, because events change and the timeline changes and I can't jump 5 years and that kind of thing. But to begin with, it was really, really difficult. I was essentially dancing between the raindrops whilst also throwing a bunch of other stuff in that, unless you're a really close historian for that period, you won't realize is fiction. So there are mirrors of things in the book. So in the front of the book, I mentioned the thing called the House of Strength, or the Zircana, which is real, but there's something else in the book that mirrors it that is fictional. So there's things like that someone would read it and go, oh, that makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense too. And I'm thinking, good.
Yes, of course.
Excellent.
All according to plan.
All according to my plan. Yeah.
Right.
So there are a couple of other things, like my copy editor read it, and there are a couple of anachronisms in it. Like she said, you've got someone drinking coffee. Technically, they probably wouldn't have had it then. And I spoke to some friends, and one said, if the coffee was coming from South America, where a lot of coffee comes from now, it wasn't there in that era. However, they could have got coffee from Ethiopia and some of the other countries in Africa and transported it. So if you really wanted to have coffee, you could, if it's critical to the plot. And I'm like, it was just someone having a drink. No. So I took it out and changed it to tea, and tea's okay, mostly, but we'll leave it with tea. And but that kind of stuck out. I tried to avoid modern phrases people saying yeah and okay and how are you and things like that. I mean, I did, so the language, while modern for the 21st century up to a point, I've tried to rough off some of the harsher edges as well in other places. And again, the more barriers I put in place for a reader who doesn't know this world, the more likely they're going to stumble. And I want them to enjoy the story, not be constantly going, get the dictionary out. What's that word mean? Oh, right. Okay. Who's that? Right. Okay. And then carry on again. I'm like, they've lost the story then at that point.
Yeah. Right. I was really interested in this idea that Charles read earlier. You note that it's in a part of the world many people know little or nothing about. And I was like, a lot of our listeners who are avid fantasy readers, and myself included, it's like we probably know a lot more about Westeros and Middle Earth than we do about the history of the Mongolian Empire. You said something in Westeros, we're like, okay, I know all the houses.
Okay.
All
the houses. Yeah, we got it.
And then here I'm like, was this an actual con? I'm like talking about your main characters here, and I'm like, oh yes, real character here.
Did the Mongols really siege that city? But meanwhile, oh yeah, they took over King's Landing. Sure, I knew that.
Right.
Oh yeah.
And this made up year too.
You're almost presented with. Yeah, go ahead.
Just say the years, like you'd be like 772 after so and so, right? That's after the Battle of so and so, the two rivers. Yeah, I got you right. Yeah. Right, okay. But,
I know about 8 generations of Targaryens, but only two of Genghis Khan. So
right, this isn't Genghis Khan. I'm lost. But you did a great job of introducing the characters.
So, the story takes place in 1260 AD for those who are keeping track, and it follows one of the 4 characters who rules one of the 4 main areas, and he's the grandson of Genghis Khan. So there's references to Genghis Khan, whose real name was Temujin Khan, and he died, and then his one of his relatives took over, and then his grandsons all took over, and some of the main events at the very beginning happened as well. Someone dies, and it triggers who's going to become the next great Khan, and all those kind of things, and all those things are true. And some of the really odd things in there are also true. It's not really a spoiler. There's the silver fountain in the Mongolian capital, which is real. At first, I thought that can't be real. And I looked into it, and it's absolutely real. It's this drinks fountain, essentially, that was engineered by, I think it was a French architect and engineer, that essentially, instead of having water coming out, it was different alcoholic drinks that would constantly and permanently flow in the capital city. So you didn't need to go up to the bar. You just went up to the fountain, stuck out your glass. There you are. Thanks very much.
Cheers. Put
it up again.
Probably safer to drink than the water,
Yep. And this is why one of the Khans died of gout, I think, because he basically drank himself to death, and his liver just was destroyed because he was drunk so much. So
they were playing the long game to take him out.
Yeah, this is it. Yeah, those clever Frenchmen. Yeah,
and that's the interesting thing about this, because I will say to me, I didn't know really where fantasy started and history began. All of that stuff, except for obviously when people had superpowers and stuff was blowing up. I could kind of figure that piece out, but the actual history and the settings as well is what's truly fascinating, because a lot of this is in Persia, and you describe all these beautiful things. And when Mongols, they raid cities and capitals and things, and when that happens, it's just like the immense beauty and potential of these cities is something you managed to capture so well. It's like, wow, these silver fountains, these libraries, these things that the Mongols are just gonna plow right through. And it's like, oh yeah, we have to destroy it, otherwise they won't bend to our will, you know? So it's like, man, all of this lost history as well that we're kind of reading about in here, you can really, it adds this extra level of connection, because you can feel when libraries and stuff explode in total fantasy worlds, but it's like, wow, that was really in Persia and that's gone now. Like, who knows how beautiful it could have been if it was still around today. Like, some of the things that we've lost, how history could have been different. You know, you connect with it on a different level when you use real cities, real historical events that had a real fallout in the world. And you know, you do go into some details worthy of a Hellfest Inferno Award when some of these sieges happen. I was just going by the title of the award. That's all I know about it. But
I can tell you about it. I can tell you about it. It's a great one. So it's Hellfest is a heavy metal and rock festival that they have every year or every couple of years in France. And basically they gather like the best of everyone comes. You can name a heavy metal band, they have been there. And a large number of rock and heavy metal fans read fantasy. So they just marry the two things together. French publisher said, right, we're going to do this award. Vote for your favorite for the books that are coming out this year. And they did. And you know, all the people voted. And I won that first year, the first award. So, yeah.
Wow.
Thanks to all the metal and rock fans out there in France, and they voted for me.
That's awesome. That's so cool that you were able to, you know, tap into this fan base. That's pretty cool that they all just voted for you. They wrote you in, basically, right?
Yeah,
it wasn't like a nomination.
No, it was down to like the top 6 were people like Clive Barker, Joe Abercrombie, me, and 3 others in a public vote. So other people who've won it have been Ed McDonald, Anthony Ryan. I'm trying to think some of the other people. They've also won, like in subsequent years, they've won when their various books have come out. So yeah, it's a great festival and a great award that's focused in France and French readers. But yeah, so Battlemage, which, as the title suggests, my debut, a lot of fights, a lot of wars, a lot of explosions, a lot of killing. They loved it. So, you know.
Sounds like a lot of grimdark authors get represented.
Basically, a lot of kind of darker fantasy and less the cuddly stuff at Hellfest, more the heavier stuff. Joe Abercrombie and, you know, not much cuddling in one of his books, let's be honest.
And when it is, it's pretty awkward.
Always unpleasant.
Fantastic, but it's always
unpleasant to read.
For sure. That's funny. I guess the overlap between like heavy metal and rock and stuff to fantasy for sure. Yeah. That seems like a good crew where that overlaps. And certainly you go into lots of you know, of that when you're depicting the violence of, like, say, a siege on a city or something like that. And it allows you to bring in some of those themes about conquest and the historical impact that they had, and you know, people's lost to this invasion. And it's almost like using the tool of historical accuracy within the fantasy genre to convey that kind of impact. I thought was a really unique blend, because we've read stuff from like Guy Gavriel Kay, for example, who draws very heavily from, you know, historical events and does tons of research, but his works are almost all fiction. I know he draws on like real dynasties and stuff for certain books, but I don't know if he's pulling in like actual characters, like you were mentioning, like Kublai Khan and all of that, and Genghis Khan, and working that into your story, you know. So it just hits a little different, I feel.
Yeah, it's that balance of some of the characters are real in the book, some of them are fictional, and some of them, even though we're real characters, we don't know much about them. So I think in the introduction, the author's note I mentioned about Princess Kokochin, we don't know much about her at all. The story kind of ends really suddenly and abruptly. I'm like, well, there's a huge question mark there that we don't know, and you could do all sorts of interesting things there. And so she became one of the main characters of the story.
Yeah, and that gives you a lot of flexibility when there's characters that everything is not entirely fleshed out for. I think even like getting away from, of course, Genghis and then Kublai, like those are probably the two that get the you know, the most fleshed out history established around them. But you choose some characters that give you some leeway, and it's exciting to watch you get into their heads. It's also interesting to see. You mentioned that you get into a lot of the characters that are more of the conquered than the conquerors, and you have you mentioned Princess Kokachin, you mentioned or you haven't mentioned yet, but we'll mention Kayvan, the Persian general.
Yep.
And I think it's so cool how you depict all of these characters, and it's like a very I guess morally gray depiction of pretty much all of them. I think you probably agree that every character, every one of your main characters, is morally gray. Every time you're like, oh, is it pronounced Hulagu? You're going to do a lot better than
I
me,
think so, because there's like 12 spellings, and I'm like, I'm going to pick a pronunciation and a spelling and stick with it, and that's the consistency. Sure. That's what I'm going to do.
So it's like Hulagu Khan, who's presented as among the Khans, is the peacemaker. So you're like, oh, he can't be too bad a dude. And then you get into, well, what does it mean to be a peacemaker that goes by Khan? Still, probably a lot of violent tendencies, but you get to see some of the more tender sides of him and his like romantic relationship, and that's coupled with then the absolutely brutal sides of him. And I think you go to show the like humanity of each of these characters while also getting into the aspects that like these weren't great people. They were doing some pretty messed up stuff. And we always, you mentioned Joe Abercrombie. It's like we always appreciate when these characters are fully fleshed out, warts and all. Well done with that one.
Thank you. Yeah, because even though I think in general, every time I ask someone about this and say, who's your least favorite character? Almost all of the time, everyone says Hulagu Khan. And, you know, he's the most gray, I would say, of the characters. However, no one's ever said he feels two-dimensional or he doesn't feel like a real person, because he still has hopes and dreams and ambitions and feelings and things that he wants and things that he cares about and people that he cares about. You know, his family, his sons and daughters and wives and all the rest of it. And it's stuff that he wants. And then it's a case of, well, what does he have to do to get what he wants? And he's willing to go further than a great many people, and it won't keep him up at night like it will most other people who've got perhaps more of a moral compass, or they worry about things more. He knows what needs to be done. You know, his grandfather did it before him. He started building this empire, and he says at one point to his brother, we've already accomplished far more than our grandfather ever dreamed of, and we're not done. So there's more that they want to do, but they understand it costs a lot to do it. But they see it as they're sort of like, we're willing to do it, willing to pay the personal cost, which of course is kind of an odd thing to say when they're not the one suffering. But you know, from their point of view, that's how they view it. Whereas the people being attacked and repressed and invaded, it's a very, very different story. So I'm trying to make all of them feel realistic, as you say, warts and all, because nobody is particularly good. Some of them are slightly better than the others, and some of them are really quite unpleasant people.
Right.
Yeah. Hulagu reads more like closer to a protagonist than an outright villain too, which I don't know if I certainly wouldn't call him the hero, but he's at times he does feel like he's the protagonist, or at least the mainest of the main characters. And it's hard. You really get the opportunity to choose who it is you're rooting for, which is, I feel like that's a relatively rare book where the author says, hey, like choose from among all these flawed characters. You have to find
who's your protagonist, who's your antagonist.
Definitely like
you pick someone.
Because I'd say even Abercrombie, it's by the end anyway. I won't get into any spoilers, but by the end of the trilogy, I'd say you can figure out at least who like the outright villain or villains are, and then you got a kind of harder choice between like, who am I rooting for? But here, I don't know. I don't see Hulagu as straight up villain in the story.
No.
Yeah, he has those multi-dimensional aspects.
He's, from his perspective, if he brings the whole of the world into one empire, then it'll be at peace. There'll be no conflict. Everyone will be ruled fairly. And as they said, he says sometimes to Kayvan at the beginning, sort of says, are your people suffering, or do they not have certain freedoms? Are they not allowed to worship whoever they want? And all these other things that they did. And there are things in history that show after certain Mongol invaders, not him in particular, other ones, there was a renaissance of certain things like art and culture. And sometimes when they invaded certain cities, they would spare the educated, the mathematicians, the teachers, the people who, philosophers, and sometimes people who were brought up in front of Khans ready to be, killed on the spot, came back with something witty or funny or smart. Sometimes they just chop their head off because they insulted them, or they're having a bad day, or they're hungover from all the wine and arag. But sometimes they'd reward them with huge amounts of wealth and send them off with a smile. And there are weird, complicated characters. None of them are just plain and simple. If you've seen Kublai on the TV show Marco Polo, and of course Hulagu, they collected people in their courts, all these odd and weird people that were interesting. Marco Polo himself was essentially a slave for something like 8 years whilst he was in the court of Kublai Khan. He wanted to go home and return to Venice, but they're like, no, you have an interesting way of talking about things and seeing the world, which is true. You will go out and do things for me and come back and tell me what you've seen in your clever and poetic way. And it was only eventually after he delivered Princess Kokachin to Persia, he was allowed to go home and return. And I don't think he ever left again. But it's one of these things that he was a slave in all but name, even though he slept in a nice bed and he had servants and all these other things. But they collected oddities and collected peculiar people. But then on the other hand, they'd invade a city, slaughter thousands, create towers of heads, and just monstrous acts. And I don't think it was Genghis Khan, but one of the later Khans changed the atmosphere of the Earth because they killed such a large number of people on the planet Earth that the number of dead changed the atmosphere, that like the oxygen.
Wow.
It was one of these ridiculous things, like how many people had to have died for that to have happened? And then you start thinking, yeah, they did turn the river red with the number of dead people at a certain siege. That was real. That actually happened from the number of dead bodies. And you start to think, how many would that be? And so, believe it or not, I've toned down a number of events in the book. Some of the really, really hard ones I've toned down, and I still get comments from readers and my editor occasionally going, "Oh my god, oh my god!" I'm like, "Right, history. It's a part of history. Go back and check."
Yeah. I'm trying to tone it down here, and that's but the interesting thing I like about Hulagu, which to me he's like, in my reading experience of the Judas Blossom, I'm like, okay, this to me is kind of like trying to understand the philosophy behind this Mongolian like desire to just rule the world, and what that even like what you have to be like as a human being or as a culture to be so committed to that, like just marching on beautiful places and leveling them and killing a bunch of people so you could conquer it because it's next on the map. And then Hulagu's like, and then we'll go to this place, and then we'll go to this place. And it's the drive to do that and trying to understand like why that is just the destiny of the Mongolian Empire, right? To unpack that is one of the interesting things about understanding Hulagu's like complex character in the book. It's he's someone who is very smart and very open-minded and very, in terms of like logistics, he's got his scientist guy, he's got, he's willing to listen to his wife, he's willing to, strategize and be patient, but then also he's just got this urge to hit things and kill people, so it's this interesting combination that you're like, wow, what a wild period in time that these guys almost took over the known world. They were very close.
Yeah, so like the stuff to his wife, that's real. She always traveled with him. Whenever they conquered various countries, they absorbed some of the army into their own and they'd fight for them. They had Chinese engineers, they had Persian engineers who'd help them with the siege engines and the mathematics and astrology, because they'd study the stars, not for, what's my sign saying I should fight today or not? It's more a case of what's the weather like? What's it going to happen in 2 weeks? When is winter coming? Obviously, they can't march during winter. They've got to look at harvest. They've got to look at food production, all these things, because they marched with their, on horseback. They moved so quickly. There's the Silk Road. There's transporting goods across the world. All of these things combined that make these characters based upon the real people, such fascinating and interesting ones. And I don't think it's in the book, but Hulagu did this in real life. He sent a number of letters to various people kind of saying, you should surrender now, because by the time I get there, you've seen what we've already been done. It would be in your best interest to surrender. So he wrote to the Pope. He wrote to the King of France that this is part of history, saying, you know what's coming? If it's good for you, how about you surrender and just give up Rome and say you'll come to me in my court, Pope, and bow and bend the knee. Like he didn't fully understand things, but equally he'd sit down and spend hours talking with a Buddhist philosopher because he was interested in it. And it's just such a weird, complicated character. So then you put them on a horse and he'll quite happily chop 100 people's heads off because he loves doing it.
Right.
So it's just none of them.
It's one of those things where it's like, is there ever really being done? You know, because let's say there's nothing left to conquer. He's still like, if he gets worked up, he's gonna punch somebody or something. And it's like, what happens when there's no one left to punch, buddy? Like, it's almost like by achieving the goal, you're almost dooming yourself in a way. It's the pursuit, and so there's some of that in Hulagu of like, oh, I just need to get out there and I just need to go. But then, there's sometimes where his logical brain comes in and where he's getting advised otherwise. And it's an interesting blend that like, so weird to imagine that like existing in history. It's something so complicated it has to be real,
Yeah. So I pulled on a lot of things to try and make it as feel. So hopefully you can't see the seams either, unless you're really knowledgeable about this portion of history or this period. You won't know what I've made up, apart from a couple of obvious things. But the rest of it, I've hopefully blended it together, so you can't be like, oh, that's not real and that's not real, and that
Well, I'm going out of my way to not learn about the Mongolian Empire, so I can until the last book is
by
out.
All means.
Yes, afterwards I'll enjoy comparing and contrasting. But I'm like, oh, no spoilers, no spoilers to the Nightingale and the Falcon. I can't have it. I can't. The only spoilers I have is modern day. I know Mongols and everywhere, so something happened.
Yeah, definitely.
But that's as far as I'm willing to look into it. So as much as we are drawing on history, you're also bringing in the fantastical into this story. And, without getting into any spoilers, you do have Hulagu's youngest son, Temujin, who, you're saying he's delving into something far more powerful and dangerous than they could ever imagine. So when you knew you were going to bring in like a fantastical element, a magic system, how did you go about creating something to fit seamlessly into real historical events and historical characters? What was the process like of creating this particular magic system?
It was... So the root of it is actually based in fact, which is why it also parts of it will feel familiar. There's a defunct splinter of an old religion that some of the names and some of the things I talk about were reused by this defunct kind of sect that doesn't exist, and it hasn't existed for hundreds of years. So based upon reading about this, I thought, that's a bit odd. That's an interesting kind of thing. Wonder what happened to them. And we didn't know much about them, and they didn't have any churches, and they didn't have any priests. And the more I started to delve into it, the more questions I asked, like, well, why not? Why didn't have any priests? And why don't we know much about them? And where have they gone? And what happened to them? And then I started thinking about how the Mongols were kind of very open to various religions. They'd let people pray to whoever they wanted up to a point in certain parts of the Mongolian Empire. The longer it went on, other parts converted to Islam very quickly and just kind of like spread like wildfire. Eventually the Golden Horde was completely became Muslim and that kind of thing. But to begin with, they were a lot more open. And so it was in delving into this kind of part of history and this thing that I knew nothing about. And during my research, I thought, oh, that's an interesting angle. And I started building upon what was already there again. So I don't want to say what the splinter of the religion is, because that will give away some of the things in the book, but it doesn't explain the magic system. That came from me, and it's not a spoiler to say, as the story goes on in the rest of the trilogy, you will find out more about this thing. There's things that crop up. There's other people that crop up. And you'll there again, it's not the main driving force of the story. Historical events are what's happening in the world, but they're there around the edges. It's one of the 4 characters, and he has a role to play in events. And so it's there again, it's quite different from my earlier books where the battle mages were essentially frontline artillery. The soldiers clear the battlefield, they come in, and they just wail on each other, throwing fireballs and lightning bolts, and that's kind of it. This is something totally different. So it's more subtle, it's more nuanced, and it's mostly unknown by people in the period, and of course, completely made up. So no one knows about it in history.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I also will refrain from spoilers, but I feel like you did a great job of getting a lot of action and war events and politicking. All this happens in the first book, but I feel like you're ready to really take off with the second book, and where it feels like it's one of those where the ground is laid, like we are set for things to really go next. So I'm curious, how'd you find the balance of having a first book that's extremely entertaining while still allowing it to serve this setup role? Because I found there's some other series that we've read where the first book is just like all set up and there's not really a lot of events that take place. And then there's other books where it feels like they blew through their entire idea in that first book, and you're like, I don't know where this is going in the second, but I guess they signed a deal to write a trilogy, so here they go. So how do you find that balance with writing a first book?
So with doing this set in a part of history, and it's based on history, there's no kind of easy access, off ramp. They all live happily ever after, or they all live terribly ever after, because history just keeps on rolling. So I had to, when I started writing this first book, have an end point in mind for the third book. And I planned all my books fairly detailed anyway. So I knew where I was working towards. And based upon that, even in a small amount of time that I'm covering, there were a lot of historic events. So I'm not going to run out of things to pull on. Unlike other people, as you say, they might blow all ideas in the first book. I've got tons I can pull on. If I'm stumbling or struggling, let's go and have a look at what's happening that year. Oh, right, there's 20 things I can use. But equally, I didn't want it to be just one battle, then another battle, which is what it was in history, but spread out a lot more. I wanted to show the repercussions. And by the end of that first book, quite a lot has changed in the world and for the characters and their arcs. And it's the same in the second book and the same in the third book. So every time something is changing quite a lot, the status quo at the end of every book is quite different. And I know sometimes people say the second book can feel kind of like it sags, like nothing happens. I don't think you can say that about a lot of trilogies, but this one, there's so much going on in every book. It's really not true. That the plot is constantly moving. Everything's constantly changing. Just from at the start of the Judas Blossom to the end, you've seen them change territory, move around, go to other places. Characters have gone through various arcs. Things have changed. Some of them aren't there anymore, and it carries on in that way. But it was finding the balance. Originally, there was another battle in the first book, but we took it out because it just felt like it was a bit too much. And it just felt like it was becoming too much more about just a pure war and action book, where it's focused on the characters around war and around conquest. But it shouldn't just be, right, we're done with that one. Now let's go to the next one and fight the next one. I love writing battle scenes. But as you said, when you spoke to Joe, it's like, once you've written 20 battle scenes and you get to write that 21st one, got to do something different. It's got to do something interesting. It has to be something special. And, I've done a lot of war and action books already with my previous ones. So I'm trying to do something different every time and show something, if possible, that we've not seen, and make it important to the overall story, not just, yep, they've conquered another city. It's like, well, so what? What does that mean? How does that change things for all the characters? There's a turning point with Temujin you've read where something happens and he thought, oh, great, I've done this thing and it's a good thing, and it turns out to be a terrible thing. And he hadn't thought it all through. He hadn't thought about the repercussions of what it means to the war and his father and what next. And it's like, okay. So it's that kind of thing. I wanted to put a lot of stuff in this book and move things forward, but not make it just feel like a one constant battle from start to the end of the book.
Yeah, so much of like Temujin's arc, it's a lot more personal, even though the stakes and things that happen are at the level of like shaping and changing nations and empires. It's really much more grounded in his relationship with his father and ways in which he'd like to earn his father's admiration, respect, love, all of those things. And I think that's where the best parts lie for me, are in the characters' personal journeys, and also you get into this politicking that our Game of Thrones fans would appreciate, all of these like conversations happening behind the scenes. And I'm assuming a lot of these aspects of betrayal and the like the kind of stuff happening that we're describing there with the politicking, I assume that plays a role in why you went for the title, The Judas Blossom. I'm curious, because when I first saw The Judas Blossom as the title, I'm such a fantasy reader, used to like, okay, this is going to be some sort of like magical artifact that is going to be ridiculously powerful and blah, blah, blah. So I'm waiting for them to find the Judas Blossom, this, one flower to rule them all. But it's that moment never quite comes. So it's more thematic, the name, and I'm curious to hear you in the most spoiler-free way you can get into it. Like, what motivated the title? I don't know how much, like, because sometimes I guess the title is a group process with other folks. But did you have control over the title? And if so, what went into the naming of this book?
So this is the first title in the first series where the titles haven't changed from what I originally pitched, which is quite interesting. Normally I pitch a title and it's like, well, we need to tweak it a little bit. Okay. So the title in this case refers to a poem by a Persian poet called Ferdowsi. That's where it comes from. And the poem is quite a long one and talks about various things. The title, as you say, has other inferences. So it refers to the fact that it's a Persian thing and the book is very Persian influenced and inspired. The idea of Judas is obviously betrayal, and there's a number of betrayers and people being betrayed in the book. So that's what it refers to at the same time. The title of the series, The Nightingale and the Falcon, refers to the two national birds of Persia and Mongolia. So the nightingale is the national bird of Iran, and the falcon is the national bird of Mongolia. So it suggests this kind of war, this ongoing struggle between these two nations, and that's what it's from. And there are two parts in each book that have a line of dialogue or a line of poetry, a line of something from someone that references what's going to kind of happen. So there's a thing to Sun Tzu, and there's another thing from Rumi in the book, and it's the same again. So the book 2 title is got a working title, and so far we're okay with it. And it's not, you won't be looking for the thing, but it's referring to something thematic, and the same on the third book as well. So don't be looking for the artifact for book 2, and the same for book 3.
Indiana Jones won't be swooping in, being like, that belongs in the museum, the Judas Blossom.
No. Top men.
So yes, it's ominously titled Book 1 of The Nightingale and the Falcon. What is your plans for the series? Are we doing the classic trilogy, or have you, like, how far ahead you said you're an intense plotter, so I assume you have the whole book series in mind already?
Yes, it's a trilogy. I wanted to do it as a trilogy so that I would have a good ending point, and I think doing it in 3 books is a good way to do it. I could have done a lot more. I could have done 4 trilogies connected over this period, and it only would have spanned like 2 years. But if this does well and people are interested, there are plenty of other stories to tell within this space, within this part of the world. So book 2 is written and it's done, and we have a working title that'll be out July next year, and I'm sort of halfway through book 3, and I'll finish writing book 3 by Christmas this year for 2025. So then we'll see what happens next. But yes, I've planned everything. I'm ready. I'm kind of I feel like I'm in the home stretch, even though I've just passed the halfway point on book 3. this has been sort of 4 or 5 years in total from planning and making notes right up to now, and by the end of it, it'll be kind of 7 years when book 3 comes out. I will be done. I'll be ready when book 3 comes out. I'll be like, the Judas what now? Oh yeah. Remind me what happens in that, because I would have been 2 years into something new at that point.
Wait, was that really history, or did I invent
did I make that up? I should get a book and check that. Wait, yeah, it's gonna be a thing. But yeah, I'm getting there. I'm nearly done on book 3. Yes, a trilogy, and then we'll see if the world does well, the stories will well. People want to see more from these characters. There's plenty of scope to revisit it, that's for sure.
I mean, yeah, this is only 1260, you've got hundreds of years to come through before we catch up to modern day.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on. Countries rising and falling, empires rising and falling.
Absolutely.
So is your hope then to continue with more of the historical fiction, historical fantasy type stuff in the future, even stuff other than the Mongolian Empire? Are you enjoying this? I know you said that you like to torture yourself, so I guess the answer is yes. But are you thinking of sticking in that realm in terms of the historical fantasy, or are you looking maybe to get back into the more traditional, straightforward fantasy?
My plan at the moment is to do something very different next, again, because I need to have a bit of a rest from this, because it was so intense with the research that even though it is fantasy, I had to do a lot more research. So the other day, I needed to get a character from point A to point B. And if I'm doing it in a fantasy book of my own creation, it's like, they get on a ship, they get on a dragon, they ride a turtle. What does it matter? I've made it up. I've made the rules. That's it. With this, I spent an hour and a half researching if it was possible to get from point A to point B, how you would do it, roughly how long it would take. And that's 6-8 lines in the book that someone will be like, yep, fine. Historians who know it might be like, well, that's not completely right. But everyone else won't care. They'll breeze over that paragraph, probably even skip it and carry on with the story. Who knows, skim that bit. But that took me an hour and a half. So it's been intense writing this trilogy for other reasons. I've not missed a deadline. Everything's been fine, but it's taken me a lot longer. So I want to do standalones next, if possible, very radically different ideas, experiment with a few different things. And then after that, perhaps revisit a historical fantasy series. If this one does well, I've got some ideas of where I could go and what I could do next. I could, jump forward a bunch of time. I could go back a bunch of time and see what was happening with, Genghis Khan. There's plenty of scope and plenty of places, but it's a case of, if people like it, they want to see more of this, then perhaps in the future. But I think right now, change gears, do something different, and then give myself more time to research things. I think that's the plan.
Yeah, you heard it here first. Stephen Aryan's upcoming fantasy novel. Next up will be The Turtle's Voyage, a fantasy primarily focused on turtle travel.
Super easy. Barely inconvenience.
Yeah. Gosh, it's so interesting, like the inspiration in which you drew on to create this story, and almost like the selective constraints you chose to put upon yourself to create the story. Like, it has to be accurate in these ways, but not these ways. I'm going to do this, but not this. It's almost like it's like an interesting setup to create a book. It's like, hey, here's the rules. You got to write a book. It's got to be about these characters, but you can't do this, can't do that. It has to be accurate. And in that kind of pressure, you're creating a work of fantasy, a work of fiction. And by focusing on the characters, you had mentioned that earlier, and to me, I think that's like a big part of, to me, the success of the book. Dylan and I, all of our favorite books are character driven and thematically driven, and I think that is a very rewarding aspect of this book, is that you do, in all of these, history, fantasy, different nations, espionage, all of that stuff. It comes down to the humanity of the characters and the constraints that they were put under. There's romances that that can or can't form based off of pressures and society things, and there's things that people want to do but can't do, and there's things, you know, people do things you agree with and then things you're kind of confused about it, and that's what I think, you know, really drew me to the series. And like, I can't believe Hulagu is most people's least favorite character. I'm still also kind of caught up on that a little bit because it's like he's like the main guy, you know. I'm tripping over myself thinking about that. But
I mean, it's also like I think it's always interesting, the framing of those kind of questions, because sometimes it's like, well, least favorite character. It's like, well, Hulagu's probably the last guy I want to like spend the day with in case you know, he gets angry about something. But at the same time, he might be the most compelling character for me because of all those aspects we're talking about, how multifaceted he is and how much time we get with him and get to know where he's coming from. So it's always a balance. It's like hard to ask people even those questions, because like, what do you mean your least favorite character? Like the character that you least would like as a person if you knew them, or the character that you least enjoy reading about? And I mean, I enjoyed all the main characters and their point of views, but I don't know, I think Hulagu's chapters were the ones that I was like, you know, you always see the name at the top of the page and you're like, okay, so this is what we're in for. I feel like Hulagu was the one that I was most compelled by of all of them.
No one's chosen him as their favorite character, though, apart from you guys, probably.
He's up there.
Quite telling. Quite telling.
It doesn't say anything good about us, I'm sure.
Yeah,
maybe we have a better chance of winning the coveted what is it, for podcast section of the heavy metal award.
Maybe
he's talking about the Hellfest Inferno.
Hellfest podcast,
right?
maybe.
If we embrace Hulagu Khan, we might get that Hellfest award. Podcast.
Just try and game the system.
The interesting thing about, as you're saying, writing with this within parameters is that in some ways I'd almost done work for hire for myself, as if like someone had said to me, right, go and write a Star Wars book in this period between films 5 and 6. Here's a bunch of history. Go off and do your own thing. Oh, can I blow up a Death Star? No. Oh, okay. So in some ways, it's like that. It's like I've almost prepared myself for working on the next Star Wars novels, because I've set the framework of history, certain events that can't be moved, certain things that can be moved. And then there's gaps where you're like, there's an interesting story I could tell. There's an interesting story I could tell. And they do that all the time. Like they get people in to say, right, go and write a story about an X-Wing pilot who's gone off and done something in this period. Off you go. And you get a whole bunch of info that you can't change. You've got gray areas. You have to get things signed off. You know, I wasn't getting my stuff signed off except by my editors and my agent. But equally, I didn't want to just completely ignore history totally radically. As the story goes on now, as I say, I'm gently steering the ship. It's like one of those tankers that takes so many miles to turn, you know, so many degrees. I'm kind of doing that I'm doing, you know, slowly, that by the time you get to the second book, things will have changed because you've seen it happening, and that's perfectly fine. And you get to the third book, yep, I understand why we're going here because I've seen it happen. How far it deviates from history, that's going to be less of a, let's not look too closely at that, really.
Yeah, we don't need to
it's
fact
just going to upset someone.
3, you know?
It's going to upset someone, so that's fine.
I do find it interesting, this idea that like almost this constraint inspires creativity in some ways, or restrictions inspire creativity, because if you just like write whatever you want, well, it's like, okay, well then I hop on my turtle and I go there. And then it's like, okay, well, now that I'm under some of these constraints, I have to write in these creative ways in which I'm going to get there. And now I have to consider, what would my character feel if he realized that all of a sudden it's December now and he can't go where he wants to go because it's too far away. You know, like he can't just get on. He doesn't have as many. If he had a turtle, he'd certainly get on it and go right away. He would love nothing more, but he can't. And that's frustrating, you know? So it's kind of in those constraints, and that you've kind of found ways to inspire some of these creative moments. And I find that really fascinating. And, you know, I read about it in other authors' works, and even in like, you know, shows and in stories and things. Star Wars is another great example where it's like you kind of write yourself into a corner. Sometimes you kind of creatively bankrupt yourself sometimes, but other times it's like, hey, you now have the inspiration to tell a unique story and a unique point of view and a unique period of time, what could that be like if you commit to that idea? And you really get to, when you're character focused like this book is, you get to really push out some interesting thoughts and ideas around those themes. So really fascinating stuff.
Like the weather was very much an important thing. I mean, we have it in every fantasy book and we talk about it and it changes things. And if you get to a book like Mark Lawrence's Ancestry books, where the whole world is freezing over and everyone's dying and there's only one strip that's kind of clear, that's very much an important part of the story that infects everything. Whereas in this book and other historical fiction books and historical fantasy books, the case of, right, when it gets to winter, everything stops. The war doesn't carry on because the roads are ice shut. You're not going up that mountain with 20,000 people to fight. No one's going to, you're not traveling. You have to kind of stop, go back, wait out the winter. When spring comes, we start again. And that's true. They had to do it. It's a case of, right, the war stops now, and then we lick our wounds, rebuild, and it starts again in spring. And it did. So it's historical fact. And I had to kind of lean into that too. I couldn't just be like, yeah, they've got flamethrowers and now they go and the next city. And like, that's pushing it.
And it comes at a very specific time. It's like, oh, winter's coming. When? It could be years, it could be decades.
Winter is coming. When?
It really It really depends on when's most convenient for my writing process when winter comes.
Exactly.
Perhaps no one author like that, but it's and of course you just use fire-breathing turtles instead of the flamethrowers.
But this is why they studied the heavens so carefully, and they had as astronomers and astrologers, and they built observatories to study the weather patterns because they needed to know these things. It's critical to everything, transport, merchants, food, warfare. So it's all kind of integrated and tied in. And there again, I don't have to make stuff up. And you already know what a bunch of stuff is because it's our world. So I don't need to kind of delve into that. I could just refer to things and move on.
Right. It is funny how in a fantasy story, the same thing, like, oh, winter's so harsh, you can't even move your troops. It's like, seems so fantastical and intense. And then you're like, oh, wait, that's just a thing that would happen. And they just wouldn't fight for the winter in the real world.
I'll take this city and then I'll take this city. And oh, shoot, it's November. I can't take that city. Darn it.
I did have a moment at one point when I was halfway through writing. I finished book one. I was on book two. And I suddenly thought, I was eating dinner and I dropped my fork and I thought, wait, they go to this city in February. Is that winter in this part of the world? I had to go research. Like, oh my God, is that winter in this hemisphere? Is this? Oh no. I just left my dinner and went and checked it. I was like, okay, I'm all right. Okay. Because right now, down in Australia, it's end of autumn. It's not the middle of summer where they are. They're kind of getting ready for winter. Whereas here, middle of summer, really hot and sticky. And I'm thinking things like that suddenly occurred to me. And I just thought, oh no.
Hate when that happens. Oh man, Stephen, we could talk to you all day, but it's late for us and it's even later across the pond where you are. So we don't want to keep you for too much longer. And certainly there's so much more we'd want to talk about the book, but I guess we'll have to wait until July 11th and afterwards to give people some time to check out the Judas Blossom when it finally does release. I mean, as we wrap things up, Mike, the only other thing I wanted to mention with the Judas Blossom is, we talked about the historical nature of it, the fantastical nature, but one of the things I wanted to tell you that I appreciated was that you still take the time to make the book fun and entertaining. So thank you for that, because I feel like sometimes you read these fantasy books that take themselves down this path of, it's about the Mongol Empire. It was a very serious time. People were getting killed. It was sad. It was like, but it was also kind of like shocking and entertaining, and there could be fights and battles and stakes, and we can still be entertained by it. We can be shocked and appalled by it and feel bad about it, but we can also find the entertainment value in it. And that's something I want to make sure listeners know what's in store for them, because you do get the exciting battle scenes, you get the exciting like combat scenes, fighting scenes, you have warriors, you have politicians. It is a very fun, entertainment driven book as well. So like that was a very impressive balance to strike. And like I just was appreciative of the fact that you're like, and then there's a cool hand-to-hand combat scene here, and then then there's a cool like duel here, like I'm like, yes, thank you, I appreciate that.
You're welcome, Charles.
Yes, thank you. Because sometimes, like, can this book, like, did we forget to make this fun, guys? Like, what happened?
Yeah. There's some comedy in the books, but it's humor, really. It's not kind of like laugh out loud moments. They have to kind of have a balance, I think. Even within the darkest periods, there's going to be humor. People laugh at funerals all the time because you need to. They have that release, and it's the same in the book. There's certain things that happen that are just kind of amusing or weird or funny, and that's just a part of life, really.
Well said. Well, Stephen, again, thank you so much for coming on. I think we'll wrap it up around here, but guys, be sure to check out the Judas Blossom on July 11th. And then, Stephen has several other books. How many? 9 books are we at now? Is this the 10th
Yep,
book?
this is number 9. Yeah.
This is number 9. So much to read beyond that too. So you don't want to miss any of that. I mean, guys, come on, think of it. The inaugural Hellfest Inferno Award with Battlemage. If you have not read that, what are you doing? Let's go. Rock on.
Especially our heavy metal fans out there.
Come on, man.
You got to get on this right now.
If you're listening to this and you love heavy metal and you haven't read Battlemage, like, what are you doing at this point? Like, we've hit the target demo so perfectly now that you just got to check it out. I know I'll be checking it out. I'm metal fan adjacent personally. I've been to many shows. I've had friends who are in metal bands, so I do appreciate it. It's been a hot minute though.
Okay.
But I do love me some good. I do love me some good Hellfests and Infernos and blood and guts and stuff. So I
fun. Always fun.
always good, right?
And
you wonder why Hulagu is his favorite character.
Yeah, it all makes sense now. Suddenly, it all just makes sense. I'm like, okay, I get it. Yeah,
it's still fiction, guys. It's still entertaining.
Yeah, it's not real. It's not like it really happened.
Or definitely not.
No
very
spoilers.
Creative, to come up with this whole Mongolian Empire is very well thought out, and luckily nothing like that existed in the real world.
1260 Persia, how inspired. Cool. All right, Stephen, thank you for coming on, and thank you so listeners for listening. We greatly appreciate it. And as always, guys, go forth and conquer, friends.